Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Dr. Ayaz Afsar, and our topic today is the ethics of educational and social research. The awareness of ethical concerns in research is reflected in the growth of relevant literature and in the appearance of regulatory codes of research practice formulated by various agencies and professional bodies. A major ethical dilemma is that which requires researchers to strike a balance between the demands placed on them as professional scientists in pursuit of truth and their subjects' rights and values potentially threatened by the research. This is known as the costs-benefits ratio, the essence of which is outlined by Frankfurt, Nachmius and Nachmius 1992, and is a concept I will return to later in the lecture. Ethical problems for researchers can multiply surprisingly when they move from the general to the particular and from the abstract to the concrete. Ethical issues may stem from the kinds of problems investigated by social scientists and the methods they use to obtain valid and reliable data. This means that each stage in the research sequence raises ethical issues. They may arise from the nature of the research project itself, the context for the research, the procedures to be adopted, methods of data collection, the nature of the participants, the type of data collected, and what is to be done with the data. This part of the lecture presents first a conspectus of the main issues that may confront researchers. Each research undertaking is an event sui generis, unique, and the conduct of researchers cannot be forced into a Procrustean system of ethics. When it comes to the resolution of a specific moral problem, each situation frequently offers a spectrum of possibilities. I will review several issues in the ethical field. These can constitute a set of initial considerations that researchers should address in planning research. What are they? Informed consent, gaining access and acceptance in the research setting, the nature of ethics in social research, generally sources of tension in the ethical debate, including non-maleficence, beneficence, and human dignity, absolutist and relativist ethics, problems and dilemmas. Ethics, problems and dilemmas confronting the researcher, including matters of privacy, anonymity, confidentiality, betrayal, and deception. Ethical problems endemic in particular research methods, ethics and evaluative research, regulatory ethical frameworks, guidelines and codes of practice for research, personal codes of practice, sponsor research, responsibilities to the research community. I'll put a brief introduction and explanation of each of them in the following lecture. While many of these issues concern procedural ethics, we have to recall that ethics concern right and wrong, good and bad, and so procedural ethics are not enough. One has to consider how the research purposes, contents, methods, reporting, and outcomes abide by ethical principles and practices. Before this, however, I will examine another fundamental concept which, along with the cost-benefits ratio, contributes to the bedrock of ethical procedures, that of informed consent. Okay, the first one is the informed consent, and what does it stand for? Much social research necessitates obtaining the consent and cooperation of subjects who are to assist in investigations and of significant others in the institutions or organizations providing the research facilities. While some cultures may not be stringent about informed consent, in others there are strict protocols for informed consent. Informed consent is particularly important if participants are going to be exposed to any stress, pain, invasion of privacy, or if they are going to lose control over what happens. Such informed consent requires full information about the possible consequences and dangers. The principle of informed consent arises from the subject's right to freedom and self-determination. Being free is a condition of living in a democracy, and when participants and limitations are placed on that freedom, they must be justified and consented to, as in research. Consent thus protects and respects the right of self-determination and places some of the responsibility on the participants should anything go wrong in the research. As part of the right to self-determination, the subject has the right to refuse to take part or to withdraw once the research has begun. This informed consent implies informed refusal. Informed consent can be defined as the procedures in which individuals choose whether to participate in an investigation after being informed of facts that would be likely to influence their decisions. This definition involves 4 elements, that is competence, voluntarism, full information, and comprehension. Competence applies that responsible, mature individuals will make correct decisions if they are given the relevant information. It is incumbent on researchers to ensure they do not engage individuals incapable of making such decisions because of immaturity or some form of psychological impairment. Voluntarism entails applying the principle of informed consent and thus ensuring that participants freely choose to take part or not in the research and guarantees that exposure to risks is undertaken knowingly and voluntarily. This element can be problematized, especially in the field of medical research, where unknowing patients are used as guinea pigs. Full information implies that consent is fully informed, though in practice it is often impossible for researchers to inform subjects on everything. For example, on the statistical treatment of data, and as we shall see below, on those occasions when the researcher themselves do not know everything about the investigation. In such circumstances, the strategy of reasonably informed consent has to be applied. Compensation refers to the fact that participants fully understand the nature of the research project, even when procedures are complicated and entail risks. Suggestions have been made to ensure that subjects fully comprehend the situation they are putting themselves into, for example, by using highly educated subjects by engaging a consultant to explain difficulties or by building into the research scheme a time lag between the request for participation and decision time. If these four elements are present, researchers can be assured that subjects' rights will have been given appropriate consideration. It must also be remembered that there are some research methods where it is impossible to seek informed consent. Covert observation or experimental techniques involving deception, obedience to authority experiments would by their very nature rule out the option. And of course, there may be occasions when problems arise even though consent has been obtained. Burgess, 1989, for example, cites his own research in which teachers had been informed that research was taking place, but in which it was not possible to specify exactly what data would be collected or how they would be used. It could be said in this particular case that individuals were not fully informed that consent had not been obtained and that privacy had been violated. As a general rule, however, informed consent is an important principle. It is this principle that will form the basis of an implicit contractual relationship between the researcher and the researched, and will serve as a foundation on which subsequent ethical considerations can be structured. From the remarks on informed consent so far, we may appear to be assuming relationship between peers, researcher and teachers. For example, a researcher professor and graduate students, and this assumption would seem to underpin many of the discussions of an ethical nature in the research literature generally. However, much educational research involves children who cannot be regarded as being on equal terms with the researcher, and it is important to keep this in mind at all stages in the research process, including the point where informed consent is sought. There are other aspects of the problem of informed consent in relation to young or very young children. Seeking informed consent with regard to minors involves two stages. First, researchers consult and seek permission from those adults responsible for the prospective subjects, and second, they approach the young people themselves. The adults in question will be, for example, parents, teachers, tutors, psychiatrists, youth leaders, or team coaches, depending on the research context. Informed consent requires an explanation and description of several factors, including, for example, the purposes, contents, and procedures of the research, any foreseeable risks and negative outcomes, discomfort or consequences, and how they will be handled, benefits that might derive from the research incentives to participate, and rewards from participating, right to voluntary non-participation, withdrawal and rejoining the project, rights and obligations to confidentiality and non-disclosure of the research, participants and outcomes disclosure of any alternative procedures that may be advantageous, opportunities for participants to ask questions about any aspect of the research, signed contracts for participation. The relevance of the principle of informed consent becomes apparent at the initial stage of the research project, that of access to the institution or organization where the research is to be conducted, and acceptance by those whose permission one needs before embarking on the task. I highlight this stage of access and acceptance in particular at this point because it offers the best opportunity for researchers to present their credentials as serious investigators and establish their own ethical position with respect to their proposed research. Investigators cannot expect access to a nursery, school, college, or university as a matter of right. They have to demonstrate that they are worthy as researchers and human beings of being accorded the facilities needed to carry out their investigations. The advice is to gain permission early on with fully informed consent gained and indicating to participants the possible benefits of the research. The first stage thus involves the gaining of official permission to undertake one's research in the target community. This will mean contacting in person or in writing an appropriate official and the chairperson of the governors if one is to work in a school, along with the head teacher or principal. At a later point, significant figures who will be responsible for or assist in the organization and administration of the research will also need to be contacted. The deputy head or senior teacher, for instance, and most certainly the class teacher if children are to be used in the research. Since the researcher's potential for intrusion and perhaps disruption is considerable, amicable relations with the class teacher in particular should be fostered as expeditiously as possible. If the investigation involves teachers as participants, propositions may have to be put to the stakeholders and conditions negotiated. Achieving goodwill and cooperation is especially important where the proposed research extends over a period of time, days perhaps. In the case of an ethnographic study, months or perhaps years, where longitudinal research is involved. Access does not present quite such a problem when, for example, a one-off survey requires respondents to give up half an hour of their time, or when a researcher is normally a member of the organization where the research is taking place, an insider. Though in the case of the latter, it is generally unwise to take cooperation for granted. Where research procedures are extensive and complicated, however, or where the design is developmental or longitudinal, or where researchers are not normally based in the target community, the problems of access are more involved and require greater preparation. By such planning and foresight, both researchers and institutions will have a good idea of the demands likely to be made on both subjects and organization. It is also a good opportunity to anticipate and resolve likely problems, especially those of a practical kind. Once this kind of information has been sorted out and clarified, researchers will be in a stronger position to discuss their proposed plans in an informed, open, and frank manner, and may thereby more readily gain permission, acceptance, and support. It must be remembered that hosts will have perceptions of researchers and their intentions, and that these need to be positive. Researchers can best influence such perceptions by presenting themselves as competent, trustworthy, and accommodating. Once this preliminary information has been collected, researchers are duly prepared for the next stage, making actual contact in person, perhaps after an introductory letter with appropriate people in the organization with a view to negotiating access. The field of ethics. Whatever the specific nature of their work, social researchers must take into account the effects of the research on participants and act in such a way as to preserve their dignity as human beings. Responsibility to participants. Such is ethical behavior. Indeed, ethics has been defined as a matter of principled sensitivity to the rights of others, and that while truth is good, respect for human dignity is better. Judgments about whether behavior conflicts with professional values lie on a continuum that ranges from the clearly ethical to the clearly unethical. The point here is that ethical principles are not absolute. Generally speaking, though some maintain that they are, as we shall see shortly, but most be interpreted in the light of the research context and of other values at stake. Of course, a considerable amount of research does not cause pain or indignity to the participants. Self-esteem is not necessarily undermined, nor confidence is betrayed, and the social scientists may only frequently be confronted with an unresolvable ethical dilemma. Where research is ethically sensitive, however, many factors may need to be taken into account, and these may vary from situation to situation. For example, the age of those being researched, whether the subject matter of the research is a sensitive area, whether the aims of the research are in any way subversive vis-à-vis subjects, teachers, or institution. The extent to which the researcher and researched can participate and collaborate in planning the research, how the data are to be processed, interpreted, and used. What are the sources of tension in research ethics? That is, non-maleficence or beneficence and human dignity. The first tension is that which exists between two sets of related values held by society: a belief in the value of free scientific inquiry in pursuit of truth and knowledge, and a belief in the dignity of individuals and their right to those considerations that follow from it. It is this polarity that is called as the cost-benefits ratio, and by which greater consideration must be given to the risks to physical, psychological, humane, proprietary, and cultural values than to the potential contribution of research to knowledge. That is the issue of non-maleficence, where no harm is wished upon subjects occurs. Non-maleficence, do not harm, is enshrined in the Hippocratic Oath, in which the principle of primum non nocere, first of all do no harm, first of all do no harm, is held as a guiding precept so also with research. At first sight, this seems uncontentious. Of course, we do not wish to bring harm to our research subjects. However, what constitutes harm is unclear. One person's harm is a society's benefit, and whether a little harm for a few is tolerable in the interest of a major benefit for all, or even for the person concerned, throws into relief the tension involved here. The question is whether the end justifies the means. As a general principle, we would advocate the application of primum non nocere, and indeed ethics regulatory boards, for example, in universities perusing research proposals, are guided heavily by this principle. However, there could be tensions here. What do you do if you discover that the head teacher has a serious alcohol problem or is having an affair with a parent? What do you do if your research shows teachers in the school with very serious weaknesses such that their contracts should be terminated in the interest of the students? When researchers are confronted with dilemmas such as these, though they are likely to occur much less in education than in social psychology or medicine, it is generally considered that they resolve them in a manner that avoids the extremes of, on the one hand, giving up the idea of research, and on the other, ignoring the rights of the subjects. At all times, the welfare of subjects should be kept in mind, even if it involves comprising the impact of the research. Researchers should never lose sight of the obligations they owe to those who are helping, and should constantly be alert to alternative techniques should the ones they are employing at the time prove controversial. In the final reckoning, the decision to go ahead with a research project rests on a subjective evaluation of the cost both to the individual and society. The corollary of non-maleficence is beneficence. What benefits will research bring? What benefits will the research bring, and to whom? Many would-be participants could be persuaded to take part in research if it is made clear that it will or may bring personal, educational, and social benefits. For example, it may lead to the improvement of learning, increased funding and resources for a particular curriculum area, improved approaches to the teaching of a subject, increased self-esteem for students or additional teachers in a school or a college. While it is sometimes worth including a statement of potential benefit when contacting schools and individuals, it may also be an actual requirement for ethics, regulatory boards, or sponsors. The second source of tension in this context is that generated by the competing absolutist and relativist positions. The absolutist view, the absolutist view holds that clear set principles should guide the researchers in their work, and that these should determine what ought and what ought not to be done. To have taken a wholly absolutist stance, where the researchers studied interpersonal dynamics in a simulated prison would have meant that the experiment should not have taken place at all, or that it should have been terminated well before the 6th day. Zimbabwe 1984 has stated that the absolutist ethical position, in which it is unjustified to induce any human suffering, would bring about the end of much psychological or medical research, regardless of its possible benefits to society. Both sides have a weakness. If, for instance, as the absolutists usually insist, there should be informed consent, it may leave relatively privileged groups under research, since they will say no, and underprivileged groups, over-researched, they have nothing to lose and say yes in hope. If the individual conscience is the guide, as the relativist insists, the door is wide open for the unscrupulous, even immoral researcher. Whatever the ethical stance one assumes, and no matter what forethought one brings to bear on one's work, there will always be unknown, unforeseen problems and difficulties lying in wait. In absolutist principle, duty ethics of principles, deontological model, research is governed by universal precepts such as justice, honesty, and respect, among others. In the utilitarian ethics of consequences, ethical research is judged in terms of its consequences. For example, increased knowledge, benefit for many. Those who hold a relativist position would argue that there can be no absolute guidelines and that ethical considerations will arise from the very nature of the particular research being pursued at the time. Situation determines behavior. This underlies the significance of situated ethics, where overall guidelines may offer little help when confronted with a very specific situation. There are some contexts where neither the absolutist nor the relativist position is clear-cut. This kind of omission can be avoided if the experimenters are prepared to spend a few minutes with subjects afterwards in order to thank them for their participation, answer their questions, reassure them that they did well, and generally talk to them for a time. If the research involves subjects in a failure experience, isolation or loss of self-esteem, for example, researcher must ensure that the subjects do not leave the situation more humiliated, insecure, and alienated than when they arrived. From the subject's point of view, procedures which involve loss of dignity, injury to self-esteem, or affect trust in rational authority are probably most harmful in the long run and may require the most carefully organized ways of recompensing the subject in some way if the researcher chooses to carry on with those methods. A related and not significant issue concerns the formal recognition of those who have assisted in the investigation. If such be the case, this means that whatever form the written account takes, be it report, article, chapter or thesis, and no matter the readership for which it is intended, its authors must acknowledge and thank all who helped in the research, even to the extent of identifying by name those whose contribution was significant. Ethical dilemmas raise 10 questions, 10 questionable practices in social research. Ethical dilemmas raise 10 questionable practices in social research. Number 1, involving people without their knowledge or consent. Number 2, coercing them to participate. Number 3, withholding information about the true nature of the research. Number 4, deceiving participants in other ways. Number 5, inducing them to commit acts diminishing their self-esteem. I'll say again, inducing them to commit acts diminishing their self-esteem, violating rights of self-determination, for example, in studies seeking to promote individual change, exposing participants to physical or mental stress, invading their privacy, withholding benefits from some participants, for example, in comparison groups, not treating participants fairly or with consideration or with respect. Interestingly, Robson's study 1993 calls these questionable practices rather than areas to be proscribed, indicating that they are not black and white, right or wrong matters. They constitute the problem of ethical dilemmas. At the beginning of this lecture, I spoke of the cost-benefits ratio, Frankfurt, Nehemias and Nehemias 1992 study. Expressed this as a conflict between two rights, the right to conduct research in order to gain knowledge versus the rights of participants to self-determination, privacy, and dignity. This constitutes the fundamental ethical dilemma of the social scientists, for whom there are no absolute right or wrong answers. Which position is favored or how a balance between the two is struck will depend very much on the background, experience, and personal values of the individual researcher. I will examine here other dilemmas that may confront investigators once they have come to some accommodation with this fundamental dilemma and decided to proceed with their research. First of all, privacy. For the most part, individual right to privacy is usually contrasted with public right to know, and this has been defined in the ethical guidelines for the Institutional Review Committee for Research with Human Subjects as that which extends to all information relating to a person's physical and mental condition, personal circumstances, and social relationships, which is not already in the public domain. It gives to the individual or collectivity the freedom to decide for themselves when and where, in what circumstances, and to what extent their personal attitudes, opinions, habits, eccentricities, doubts, and fears are to be communicated to or withheld from others. In the context of research, therefore, right to privacy may easily be violated during the course of an investigation or denied after it has been completed. At either point, the participant is vulnerable. The setting being observed may vary from very private to completely public. The home, for example, is considered one of the most private settings, and intrusions into people's homes without their consent are forbidden by law. Dissemination of information concerns the ability to match personal information with the identity of the research participants. Indeed, Personal data are defined at law as those data which uniquely identify the individual providing them. When such information is publicized with names through the media, privacy is seriously violated. The more people there are who can learn about the information, the more concern there must be about privacy. As is the case with most rights, privacy can voluntarily unrelinquished. Research participants may choose to give up their right to privacy either by allowing a researcher access to sensitive topics or settings, or by agreeing that the research report may identify them by name. In the latter case, at least, would be an occasion where informed consent would need to be sought. Generally speaking, if researchers intend to probe into the private aspects or affairs of individuals, their intention should be made clear and explicit, and informed consent should be sought from those who are to be observed or scrutinized in private context. Other methods to protect participants are anonymity and confidentiality, and the examination of those follows. Privacy is more than simple confidentiality. The right to privacy means that a person has the right not to take part in the research, not to answer questions, not to be interviewed, not to have their home intruded into, not to answer telephone calls or emails, and to engage in private behavior in their own private place without fear of being observed. It is freedom from as well as freedom for. This is frequently an issue with intrusive journalism, and researchers may have an obligation to inform participants of their rights to refuse to take part in any or all of the research, to obtain permission to conduct the research, to limit the time needed for participation, and to limit the observation to public behavior. Frankfurt, Nachmias and Nachmias 1992 underlined the need for confidentiality of participants' identities, and that any violation of this should be made with the agreement of the participants. The essence of anonymity is that information provided by participants should in no way reveal their identity. The obverse of this is personal data that uniquely identify their supplier. A participant or subject is therefore considered anonymous when the researcher and another person cannot identify the participant or subject from the information provided. Where this situation holds, a participant's privacy is guaranteed, no matter how personal or sensitive the information is. Thus, a respondent completing a questionnaire that bears absolutely no identifying marks, names, addresses, occupational details, or coding symbols is ensured complete and total anonymity. A subject agreeing to a face-to-face interview, on the other hand, can in no way expect anonymity. At most, the interviewer can promise confidentiality. Non-traceability is an important matter, and this extends to aggregating data in some cases so that an individual response is unknowable. The second way of protecting a participant's right to privacy is through the promise of confidentiality. This means that although researchers know who has provided the information or are able to identify participants from the information given, they will in no way make the connection known publicly. The boundaries surrounding the shared secret will be protected. The essence of the matter is the extent to which investigator keeps faith with those who have helped them. It is generally at the access stage or at the point where researchers collect their data that they make their position clear to the hosts and subjects. They will thus be quite explicit in explaining to subjects what the meaning and limits of confidentiality are in relation to the particular research project. On the whole, the more sensitive, intimate, or discrediting the information, the greater is the obligation on the researcher's part to make sure the guarantees of confidentiality are carried out in spirit and letter. Promises must be kept. Kimmel Study 1988 notes that some potential respondents in research on sensitive topics will refuse to cooperate when an assurance of confidentiality is weak, vague, not understood, or thought likely to be breached. He concludes that the usefulness of data in sensitive research areas may be seriously affected by the researcher's inability to provide a credible promise of confidentiality. Assurances do not appear to affect cooperation rates, innocuous studies perhaps, because as Kimmel suggests, there is expectation on the part of the most potential respondents that confidentiality will be protected. A number of techniques have been developed to allow public access to data and information without confidentiality being betrayed. This is particularly the case where the evidence is negative. One way out, Kelly Study 1989 suggests, could be to submit reports and evaluations of teachers' reactions to the teachers involved for comment to get them to assess their own changing attitudes. She warns, however, that this might work well with teachers who have become converts, but is more problematic where teachers remain indifferent or hostile to the aims of the research project. How does one write on an honest but critical report of teachers' attitudes, she asks, if one hopes to continue to work with those involved? Deception may lie in not telling people that they are being researched. So deception lie in not telling people that they are being researched, not telling the truth, telling lies, or compromising the truth. It may also lie in using people in a degrading or dehumanizing way. In social psychological research, this term is applied to that kind of experimental situation where the researcher knowingly conceals the true purpose and conditions of the research, or else positively misinforms the subjects or exposes them to unduly painful, stressful, or embarrassing experiences without the subjects having knowledge of what is going on. The term betrayal is usually applied to those occasions where data disclosed in confidence are revealed publicly in such a way as to cause embarrassment, anxiety, or perhaps suffering to the subject or participant disclosing the information. It is a breach of trust in contrast to confidentiality, and is often a consequence of selfish motives of either a personal or professional nature. One of the research methods that is perhaps most vulnerable to betrayal is action research. Kelly 1989 notes this can produce several ethical problems. She says that if we treat teachers as collaborators in our day-to-day interactions, it may seem like betrayal of trust if these interactions are recorded and used as evidence. Deception may be justified on the grounds that the research serves the public good and that the deception prevents any bias from entering the research, and also that it may protect the confidentiality of a third party. The problem from the researcher's point of view is what is the proper balance between the interests of science and the thoughtful, humane treatment of people who innocently provide the data. In other words, the problem again hinges on the cost-benefits ratio. The pervasiveness of the issue of deception becomes even more apparent when we remember that it is even built into many of our measurement devices, since it is important to keep the respondent ignorant of the personality and attitude dimensions. There are many problems that cannot be investigated without deception, and although there is some evidence that most subjects accept without resentment the fact of having been duped once they understand the necessity for it, it is important to keep in the forefront of one's mind the question of whether the amount and type of deception is justified by the significance of the study and the unavailability of alternative procedures. Ethical problems arising from research methods used in educational contexts occur per se in Burgess's study 1989, that is basically an edited collection. The ethics of educational research, and in Simon and Usher's 2000 edited volume, Situated Ethics in Educational Research. Every contribution in these reflects the reality of the day-to-day problems, issues, and dilemmas that the educational researcher and beginning researchers are likely to encounter. Newcomers to the field need to be aware of those kinds of research which by their nature lead from one problem to another. Indeed, the researcher will frequently find that methodological and ethical issues are inextricably interwoven in much of the research it has designated as qualitative or interpretative. Doing participant observation or interviewing one's peers raises ethical problems that are directly related to the nature of the research technique employed. The degree of openness or closure of the nature of the research and its aims is one that directly faces the teacher-researcher. They go on to pose the kinds of questions that may arise in such a situation, wherefore the researcher does formal observation and an informal observation begin. Is it justifiable to be open with some teachers and close with others? How much can the researcher tell the pupils about a particular piece of research? When is a casual conversation part of the research data and when is it not? Is gossip legitimate data, and can the researcher ethically use material that has been passed on in confidence? The ethics of educational evaluation offers two broad principles which may form the basis of further considerations in the field of evaluation. These are the principles of benefit maximization and the principle of equal respect. The former, the principle of benefit maximization, holds that the best decision is the one that results in the greatest benefit for most people. It is pragmatic in the sense that it judges the rightness of our actions by their consequences. or the best action is the one with the best results. Strike 1990 lists the following ethical principles which he regards as particularly important to evaluate research and which may be seen in the light of the two broad principles outlined above. Due process. Evaluate procedures must ensure that judgments are reasonable, that known and accepted standards are consistently applied from case to case, that evidence is reasonable, and that there are systematic and reasonable procedures for collecting and testing evidence. Privacy. This involves a right to control information about oneself and protects people from unwarranted interference in their affairs. Equality. In the context of evaluation, this can best be understood as a prohibition against making decisions on irrelevant grounds such as race, religion, gender, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Public perspicuity. This principle requires openness to the public concerning evaluative procedures, their purposes and their results. Humaneness. This principle requires that consideration is shown to the feelings and sensitivities of those in evaluative contexts. Client benefit. This principle requires that evaluative decisions are made in a way that respects the interests of students, parents, and the public. In preference to those of educational institutions and their staff, this extends to treating participants as subjects rather than as research fodder. Academic freedom. This requires that an atmosphere of intellectual openness is maintained in the classroom for both teachers and students. Evaluation should not be conducted in a way that chills this environment. Respect for autonomy. Teachers are entitled to reasonable discretion in and to exercise reasonable judgment about their work. Evaluation should not be conducted so as to unreasonably restrict discretion and judgment. Ethical regulations exist at several levels: legislation, ethics review committees to oversee research in universities and other institutions. Ethical codes of the professional bodies and associations, as well as the personal ethics of individual researchers, are all important regulatory mechanisms. All investigators, from undergraduates pursuing a course-based research project to professional researchers striving at the frontiers of knowledge, must take cognizance of the ethical codes and regulations governing their practice. Failure to meet these responsibilities on the part of researchers is perceived as undermining the whole scientific process and may lead to legal and financial penalties and liabilities for individuals and institutions. Professional societies and associations have formulated codes of practice which express the consensus of values within a particular group and which help individual researchers in indicating what is desirable and what is to be avoided. Of course, this does not solve all problems, for there are few absolutes, and in consequence, ethical principles may be open to a wide range of interpretations. The establishment of comprehensive regularity mechanism is well founded in some of the countries, such as the United Kingdom, but it is perhaps in the field of information and data how they are stored and the uses to which they are put. For example, the educational researchers are likely to find growing interest. This category would include, for instance, statistical data, data used as the basis of evaluation, curricular records, written records, transcripts, data sheets, personal documents, research data, computer files, and audio and video recordings. Data misuse, therefore, or disclosure at the wrong time or to the wrong client or organ can result in the most unfortunate consequences for an individual, group, or institution. And matters are greatly exacerbated if it is the wrong information or incomplete or deliberately misleading. Data held for historical and research purposes are exempted from the principle which gives individuals the right of access to personal data about themselves, provided that data are not made available in a form which identifies individuals. Research data also have partial exemption from two further principles, with the effect that such data may be held indefinitely and the use of the data for research purposes need not be disclosed at the time of data collection. Sponsored research does not absolve the researcher from ethical behavior. For example, it may be considered unethical for the sponsor to tell the researcher how to conduct the research, what results the researcher should look for, and what findings should be suppressed, what should and should not be reported to, conceal, who the sponsor is, what are the purposes of the research. On the other hand, sponsors do have the right to remain confidential. They may have the right to non-disclosure of who they are and the purposes and findings of the research. While sponsored research is usually contractual between the researcher and the sponsor, and between the researcher and the participants, and while the research may be for the sponsor alone and not for the public, this does not privilege the sponsor in dictating how the research should be conducted and what it should find, in short, fixing the study. Of course, the researcher's responsibilities may lie only in conducting the study and providing the sponsor with a report. What happens to the report after that is a matter for the sponsor. However, this does not absolve the researcher from decisions about the conduct of the study, and the researcher must retain the right to conduct the study as he or she thinks fit, informed by but not decided by the sponsor. The researcher's integrity must be absolute. The researcher should not succumb to pressure to betray the confidentiality of the respondents, tamper with data, their analysis of presentation to meet a particular objective, present selective and unrepresentative data, and conclusions make recommendations that do not arise from the data themselves. Use the data for non-negotiated personal interests, agendas, purposes, and advancement. Conduct a study in which personal research objectives influence the nature, contents, and conduct of the research. The researcher has obligations to the sponsor, but not to doctor or compromise the research. In this lecture, I have attempted to acquaint you with some of the ethical difficulties you are likely to experience in the conduct of such research. It is not possible to identify all potential ethical questions or adjudicate on what is correct research behavior. It is hoped that this information will have induced in you a certain disposition that will enable you to approach your own projects with a greater awareness and fuller understanding of the ethical dilemmas and moral issues lurking in the interstices of the research process. However inexperienced in these matters researchers are, they bring to social research a sense of rightness on which they can construct a set of rational principles appropriate to their own circumstances and based on personal, professional, and social values. Although no code of practice can anticipate or resolve all problems, there is a six-fold advantage in fashioning a personal code of ethical practice. First, such a code establishes one as a member of wider scientific community having a shared interest in its values and concerns. Second, a code of ethical practice makes researchers aware of their obligations to their subject and also to those problem areas where there is a general consensus about what is acceptable and what is not. In this sense, it has a clarificatory value. Third, when one's professional behavior is guided by a principled code of ethics, then it is possible to consider that there may be alternative ways of doing the same thing, ways that are more ethical or less unethical should one be confronted by an oral challenge. Fourth, a balanced code can be an important organizing factor in researchers' perceptions of the research situation and as such may assist them in their need to anticipate and prepare. Fifth, a code of practice validated by their own sense of rightness will help researchers to develop an intuitive sensitivity that will be particularly helpful to them in dealing with the unknown and the unexpected, especially where the more fluidic methods such as ethnography, participant observation are concerned. And sixth, a code of practice will bring discipline to researchers' awareness. Well, that is the end of today's lecture. Thank you very much for listening and goodbye.